Aren't you sick to death of hearing about housework, overburdened women slaving to care for their families, and men who fail to pull their weight? Whining about the burden of women's second shift is one of the favoured themes of modern feminism, but like most of their complaints, it's a load of hogwash. I've always been fascinated by the research showing how many hours of work men and women contribute to their households. It's a classic example of how our major institutions, led by mainstream media, put a feminist spin on important research, demonising men and pretending women are really badly done by. The media story is always the same: exhausted women carrying an unfair burden of housework and childcare, whilst lazy men benefit from their labours. The true picture is very different. In Australia, there's this solid research called the Time Use Survey, which was conducted here between 1992 and 2006, although they're going to be doing another one of these soon. The Time Use Survey is based on diaries where people actually kept notes about how they spent their time, which allowed for proper calculations of combined activities, such as caring for kids whilst watching TV or cooking dinner. Now, every time that survey was released, much the same picture emerged. Men and women do equal amounts of work if you add all paid plus unpaid work. There's similar research in the US and various European countries showing identical results, men putting in the same hours of total work as women. Look at this. This is a graph comparing the US to Australia. It comes from an article by Professor Michael Bittman, who was one of the experts who were involved with the time use study. First, see the total hours for men and women in each country. US men are working the hardest overall, but we see men and women pulling their weight pretty much equally in both countries. A very different picture from the constant media story. Okay, here you can see the huge gap in paid work hours for men and women in both countries. Americans do slightly more paid work than we do. This data was published almost a decade ago when we had current time use surveys, and it's possible things have changed a little since then. Now look here, this is the unpaid work figures for the two countries, showing men doing similar amounts, but Australian women working more hours in the home. Aussie women are more likely to be working part-time, of course. What drove me crazy during all those years I was writing about the time use surveys was the fact that most of the media only ever reported the gaps between men and women in the amount of housework being done. They never talked about total work. I had regular run-ins with the Australian Bureau of Statistics over there, regular press releases whinging about men not doing enough housework, which were published every time they released a new survey. They hardly ever mentioned the issue of equal amounts of total work. We've just had some other survey data released from a longitudinal study called HILDA. That's the Household Income and Labour Dynamics in Australia survey, which has been tracking what's been happening in our households for 14 years. They've just released their 2016 survey report, which included data tracking hours of work for men and women over that time. It presents a similar picture to the time use data. Look at this graph covering the period from 2002 to 2016, and we're looking first at men's employment. You'll see that hours spent on employment for men hugely outweighs any other activity for men or women. The blue line at the top is the hours men spend in paid employment, compared to the other lines showing the time men and women spend on housework, childcare, and also women's paid employment. So pulling that graph apart, you can see the comparison of hours spent by men and women on paid employment over that 14 years period. Males in blue, women in pink. Men are still the major breadwinner in Australia by a country mile, and the long hours men are putting in haven't changed much over the last 14 years. Women's employment has increased a little, but part-time work is still the norm for most women. Look at housework. Over that time period, women are doing less housework, mainly by using more prepared food, whilst men's contribution has gone up only a little bit. And here's childcare, which is pretty stable for both men and women over that period. It's hardly a picture of slothful men and exploited women, is it? Yet somehow, when it comes to total hours of work, HILDA tells a different story. Look at this YouTube video put out by the University of Melbourne, which manages the HILDA data.
Men still spend more time in paid work, while women spend more time caring for children and relatives. So in total, women spend more time working, caring for the kids, and doing housework. On average, they spend an extra 99 hours per year. That's almost 3 full working weeks more than men.
Now, isn't that maddening? The problem with this HILDA data is it doesn't properly account for people combining more than one activity. So a woman preparing breakfast while her kids play around the house can double dip when it comes to counting hours of work. And that's one reason why the total figures are very different from the picture which emerges from the time use studies. But naturally, most of our media was delighted to promote this anti-male take on the subject. Here's SBS sneering at the idea that men do their share to contribute to the households. So here they're saying, Australian men think they do their fair share of household chores. Overburdened women disagree, the new figures reveal. Here's the Sydney Morning Herald describing changes in who does the housework, showing that men are increasing the amount they do while women are reducing theirs. But then comes the usual swipe at men. Oh, let's not get ahead of ourselves by applauding men for doing more, sneers the journalist by pointing out that women still do far more housework than men. And so it goes on. Endless male bashing which fails to give men any credit for the long hours they put in providing for their families. Most of these men do far more hours of paid work than their fathers ever did, plus doing more childcare and housework. But these days, they don't get any thanks for what they do, and that's the real difference. The anti-male bias and the way this data is presented is really destructive for our society. It fosters resentment in women by encouraging them to dismiss the long hours men contribute to the household through paid work. That breeds discontent, adding to women's unhappiness in their relationships, which is the major cause of marriage breakdown and subsequent destructive impact on children. It's just one more example of the poisonous influence of the grip of feminism on our institutions, including the mainstream media. After looking at this wonderful BBC documentary on building the £5 million super sewer under London, it's an incredible story. But what was striking to me were all these amazing men, from brilliant engineers to highly skilled welders to simply men doing hard labour, all working extraordinary hours, often doing very dangerous, dirty work, some quite literally wallowing knee-deep in shit. The health of one of the world's great cities depends on these incredible men, yet what's the bet they go home to wives who whinge that they don't do enough housework? Everybody for supporting me on my YouTube channel. I've got growing numbers of subscribers, which is really exciting. If you'd like to support me financially, go to my donate page on my website. Thanks a lot.